Okay, our Torah portion today, and you might wonder, well, how did all of that fit together? Well, did you see something that was repeated in all three? Well, I'm the Lord your God, of course. Yes, we would certainly see that. It talked in our Torah portion about the seller, a quick change of things, right? In other words, you're a slave one day, and you're free the next, right? If you're a Jewish slave and by the way, how did slavery come about in the ancient world? Well, a number of reasons, but primarily two, okay? Well, I could say three, but you would remember that the word for slave and the word for servant, and in some cases even the word for worker, are similar, okay? So you have to let the context tell you. But sometimes Israelite people would buy slaves from foreign countries to work in their fields, like farmhands, okay? And why would they do that? Why would someone in a foreign country sell themselves? Because they had nothing. They were dying from starvation and so forth and so on, and they were given the opportunity to come and be a slave to someone who would feed them and take care of them and so forth. Another reason was if you were in debt. Even if an Israelite person was in debt and couldn't pay their debts, there was no bankruptcy in ancient Israel, okay? If you didn't pay your debt, you were in trouble, major trouble. So you could sell yourself to someone and say, what would you normally pay a hired hand? Well, I'd pay him $10 an hour. Okay, well, I owe you $1,000 and I can't pay it. So I will work for you at $10 an hour until I get it paid off. And if the owner of the land accepted that, he would feed that person. He would care for that person. He would give that person a place to sleep and so forth and so on. And they would figure out how many hours or how many days he had to work until he had got it paid off. Of course, there's another way too, and that's through war. And sometimes when one nation would conquer another nation, those who were conquered had one of two choices. Either you come and be our slave, then our worker. We'll take care of you, we'll feed you, we'll give you a place to live, but you're going to work for us the rest of your life. Or you're going to be executed with the rest of the soldiers. Now, all of those are probably being touched by our Torah portion. But the one thing that's a thread throughout, and it is this, that God is the God of life, not the God of death. So even a foreigner who comes and becomes the possession of an Israelite, their life has to be preserved. Their life cannot be taken. Their life has to be preserved. Now, the big question that comes in our portion is this. What happens if you're a foreigner, you're down and out, maybe a good number of your people are dying from starvation during famines and so forth and so on, and you have the opportunity to sell yourself to an Israelite who's going to take care of you. While you're with that person, you begin to say, they worship a different God than we worship. And you begin to say, I think the God that they worship is the true God. And so then you say, I want to worship the God that you worship. Now, does that change their status? Well, there is a law, there is a commandment in the Torah that now, I know it's the same word, ger, it's the sojourner, but the sojourner who lives with you is to have the same law as you have. There's to be one law for the sojourner and for the native born. Now, in that context, I would take it to mean that this sojourner is one who, like Isaiah says in 56, has attached himself to the Lord. It doesn't say he's attached himself to Israel, which is also true, but he's attached himself to the Lord. Now he becomes your brother. Now, I know our text doesn't differentiate those things clearly because it's talking about the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, right? It's talking about the Shemitah year, 7th year, and the Jubilee year. That's our context, right, from Leviticus 25. and 26. Okay, so now let me give you another scenario I've been thinking about this week. Let's say, for instance, that you have the means, and you find a slave from another country, an unbeliever, not worshiping the God of Israel, worshiping their pagan gods, and so you purchase this person, this man or whatever in his family, so that they can work for you. Would you be likely to try to persuade them to worship the God of Israel? Well, if you did, they'd go free at the Yovel, right? Okay, so it would cost you something to give them the good news, wouldn't it? We don't think about it that way too much in our day. But what did our apostolic portion teach us? Well, you can see that in the Haftarah, in the prophetic portion, it's using the same metaphor. The buyer is like the seller, the renter is like the owner, so forth and so on. But that's in terms of being conquered, right? Everybody lose their status. When a nation comes in and conquers another nation, they don't care if you're rich or if you're poor. Everything gets leveled out, right? You can say, but wait a minute, I have real prestige in this country. You say, well, you don't anymore. You don't have any prestige with us, right? So everybody gets leveled out. So even though it's kind of a reversal in the Isaiah passage, it's linking it together, and you discover that in the more ancient times, they would link text together just by similar kinds of ideas, whether it's upside down or right side up, doesn't matter, the same kind of words. Now, what about our apostolic portion? Do we have a reversal there? Yes, we do. We have the Lord washing the feet of his disciples. And who usually washed the feet? By the way, why did you wash your feet anyway? Yeah, they normally weren't wearing shoes as we know them. They were wearing sandals, and they were in a kind of pardon me? No paved roads, right? Everything was dusty. Although they did have some roads that were rocks, that were paving rocks. But most of the time you walked and your feet got dirty. And it was not only uncomfortable. I found this out when I was visiting Africa to obtain our two adopted daughters. In a very arid climate, when you don't have shoes on, your skin cracks. But that's not the worst of it. When your skin cracks and you're walking around in the sand, there's little organisms in the sand that get into your feet. Creatures get into your feet. And in Africa, that was a very, very big problem because worms would actually internalize, and that caused all kinds of sickness. I watched at least twice when the head of the orphanage gave swats to any children who were walking without their flip-flops on. They could not walk with bare feet. So you can imagine that in that kind of an environment, you not only had to wash the feet, but you also had to anoint them, put oil on them so the skin wouldn't crack, and so forth and so on. That's the metaphor that's going on there at the Passover time with Yeshua and his disciples, right? Now, do you suppose, is it possible that the 12 consider themselves just a notch above most other people? They're regularly referred to in the Gospels as the 12, right? I'm one of the 12. You're one of the 70. That's the next tier down. I don't know if they did or not. They may not have. But it's very interesting that Yeshua uses that to say, you must see yourself as a servant. Sure, you have been chosen for a special job, And in that regard, you have authority, and we see that, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that. There are some interesting things in these passages, and in our day, it's a little difficult to speak about it, to be honest with you, because, especially in the United States, the idea that one person should own another seems contrary to all human decency. And let me just say this again. Remember, it's more of an economic issue. I paid for you, and you have to work for me a lot of hours to pay off what I paid for you. And if it relates to your life, you owe me your life if you're a foreigner, right? I saved your life, and I did it at great cost, so you're mine. Now, did you notice how God continues to say in our passage, you can't enslave an Israelite indefinitely? Why? Who does the Israelite belong to? God. He said, I'm the one that bought him. And the God who purchased us intends that we enjoy freedom. Freedom to worship him, freedom to be his the way he intends us to be, and so forth. The despicable manner in which African slaves were sometimes treated in the history of our own nation has made it nearly impossible to read the history of slavery in the ancient Near East without prejudice. Yet while in all periods of mankind's history where slavery existed, there were those who treated slaves wrongly, it is also true that there often existed a good relationship between slaves and owners of slaves. In some cases, acquiring slaves was a means of sustaining their lives. This is not to condone in any manner the barbaric treatment of another human being who was created in the image of God, examples of which are readily at hand in the history of slavery in our own nation. But our Parashah this Shabbat deals with the matter of slavery as a part of the economic structure of the ancient Near Eastern society, and particularly of the Israelite society. In addition, when the various law codes of the ancient Near East are compared, the Torah of Israel is markedly civil and humane in terms of the treatment of slaves. In the Tanakh, slaves were given many rights, and slave owners were obliged to maintain these rights as an act of obedience to God. Slaves were to be given rest on Sabbath days, given equal opportunity to engage in the worship of Israel's God, and had legal recourse if mistreated. Indeed, if a slave sustained a severe injury by his master, he was given his freedom. Slaves who were not indentured for life could be redeemed and could even redeem themselves if their means were sufficient. Most interesting is the contrast between the Torah and other ancient Near Eastern law codes in regard to retaining runaway slaves. For instance, in the code of Haftarah, sheltering a runaway slave drew the death penalty. Just the opposite is the case in Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 and 16. You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. Since a slave owned by a fellow Israelite was considered his property, and the Torah prohibits retaining what belongs to someone else, how does this law not condone theft? You understand my question? Okay. Most likely this law is prohibiting the extradition of a slave who had escaped from a foreign land and who sought refuge within the community of Israel. Since the law codes of pagan nations did not guard the life of a slave from his master, for instance, taking the life of a slave was only penalized by a payment of monetary fine in Hammurabi's code. In contrast, the slave in such a misuse gets his freedom in the Torah. The mandated refuge within Israel, therefore, was a matter of preserving the runaway slave's life. Once again, we see that the Torah provided justice for all people regardless of their ethnicity or economic status, considering the preservation of life more important than compliance with the laws of pagan nations. And the same thing happened in our country, right? I met my wife in Ohio at the school that we both went to, where her father was a professor, Cedarville University. And just down the road in Clifton was part of the Underground Railway, where they would take the slaves and hide them and bring them to that spot, and then they would go to another spot and eventually get out of the country and so forth and so on. So it's well known in that place that there were those in our own country who felt it was God's command to preserve the life of a slave. Okay, I have a question or comment here. Oh, go ahead, Joshua, then we'll go over here.
I enjoyed the question you asked what we would do if, our slave who was from one of the pagan nations would all of a sudden join himself. And it seems like that would be a hard issue, is what are we looking forward to gaining for ourselves or having one more brother who's gained to the God of Israel?
Right. And don't you agree, and I know you do, that everything in the Torah ultimately requires us to live by faith?
And you mentioned Isaiah 56. If there aren't people of the nations being joined to Adonai, then who are those of the nations who are going to be brought to his holy mountain?
Precisely. Yeah. But the question is the one who owns the person or has hired the person, is his heart right with the Lord? How much better to have a brother than a slave. Work together, and God would prosper. God promised us that if we obeyed him, he would prosper us, right? Now, sometimes the prospering isn't exactly what we would define, right? Sometimes he prospers us by putting us through hard times, right? We learn how to believe and how to trust in a way that we hadn't before. Yeah. And that tells us that there was a regular situation in which someone who had sold himself into slavery became so attached to the family, and we would presume then also perhaps to the worship of the God of Israel, that they said, I don't want to go anywhere else. I'll work for you. I'll be glad to work for you. Here, let me put my ear to the doorpost, and we'll make it final. Right? Sure. Now, still in that regard, did such a slave or such a servant go out free at the Yovel? According to our text, he did. Now, it might have been his own desire not to, but yeah. So in our Parashah, the clear contrast is made between one's countrymen, which is literally your brother, achicha. And please understand, you see, when I memorized these verses that we're rememorizing now in a different version, and even in the NSB it says, I urge you, brethren, right? And a lot of the newer translations are saying something like, I urge you, brothers and sisters, which I understand, okay? Because brethren in English sometimes is entirely male. But if you know anything about biblical literature, you know that the word b'nai, ben means son, right? B'nai Israel means, well, it's usually translated sons of Israel, but it means people of Israel. And it oftentimes describes men and women. So it's a biblical way of thinking that brethren is not gender specific in many cases. Now, I know we've moved beyond that into English, so I don't in any way put down the translations that want to add the word sister. But if you're reading it, if you're working on your Greek or something, you say it just says brothers. Well, remember that in the Bible, that isn't necessarily gender specific. It means a group of people that have a clear identity together and a bond together in some way. So it talks about your brother and people from foreign countries, literally from the nations. The Israelite is never to be a purchased slave, meaning that while he will do the work of a common purchased slave, his position as a slave or servant ends at the Shemitah, according to Exodus 21:2, including the Yovel, or the Jubilee. In other words, he is never to be considered the property of another Israelite. His position as a slave is only temporary, like that of a hired worker. The text explains why. For they are my servants whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. The Israelite belongs to God. He purchased them via the redemption from Egypt. They cannot, therefore, become the property of someone else. This is not the case with a slave or servant purchased from the pagan nations or from the foreigners who may live within the community of Israel. Such a slave or servant may become the perpetual property of the one who purchased them, meaning that their families will continue to be purchased slaves or servants from generation to generation. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, according to verse 46. Thus, in the Jubilee, only Israelites are released, not slaves from pagan nations. Now, if they're misused, according to Exodus, if they are injured by their master, they go free. Which tells us what? They had to be treated humanely. They had to be given life and sustenance of life, helped if they were sick, helped if they were injured, so forth and so on, okay? It wasn't the kind of thing, well, it's just so much I don't care if they live or die. That could not happen in Israel according to the Torah. Now, there is something here that I think we see pictured. What distinguishes the Israelite in our text from those of the pagan nations? They can't be sold perpetually, but why? They're still just men and women created in the image of God. Hashem says or the text says they are Hashem's servants. Why? He chose them. Right? You say, well, didn't he choose all the nations? What's the answer to that? No, he didn't. Amos 3 says, you, speaking to Israel, Amos 3:2 says, you only have I chosen from all the nations of the earth. Therefore, what's the next therefore? Therefore, I'm going to give you everything you want? Therefore, I will punish you for your transgressions. There's a father, son, daughter kind of a relationship, okay? Pardon me, Amos 3:2, if my mind serves me, which sometimes it does, and sometimes it tricks me. So, what is the point? Here, once again, we see the picture, and I don't mean to pound the pulpit or the mood on this necessarily over and over, but the point is simply this. God in his sovereignty, God in his own kingship, chose a nation. He didn't have to ask permission from anybody. He chose Abraham. He chose Isaac. He chose Jacob. He didn't choose Esau. He could have, but he didn't. So the offspring of Jacob become his chosen people. You say, but wait a minute. What about Joseph's sons? Were they Israelites? But were they born Israelites? No. They had an Egyptian mother. Right? So what does that tell us? It isn't that God is choosing an ethnicity. It's that God is choosing those who will be his before ever the world was created, apparently, from what we read in the Scriptures. Now, don't ask me to explain that. I can't explain it, okay? But what we see in our text is that those whom he had chosen, even when they're in the worst of situations, are to be treated differently than the outside nations. I think there's a principle there. God will care for his people, and nothing will stand in the way of him bringing about his perfect and sovereign plan for their lives. Now, that's something that we can hold on to. Say, Lord, I belong to you. And the only reason I belong to you is not because I earned it. What is grace anyway? Unmerited favor. You mean you can't win God's grace? If you win God's grace, it stops being grace. Right? To the one who works, his wages are counted as what is due. But to the one who does not work but believes. What does that tell you about faith? What does that tell you about believe? It's not a work. Say, I remember reading in, well, I won't name the author, but I remember reading in the book on, it's a book on apologetics and evidences It's something like evidence that demands a verdict, something to that effect. And it says in the back, in his own testimony, he actually wrote this. If maybe I have an old edition, but I hope it's the way I'm remembering it. He says, "I'm glad I was wise enough to choose him." Well, if I was wise enough to choose him, it's because he gave me the wisdom. I come to him, you come to him with empty hands. Say, "Lord, I have nothing to bring." I sat in the office of a banker, I don't know how many years ago, 1986. No, 1976, excuse me. Sat in the office of a banker asking, well, it was more like 80 because I had been in around 80. Anyway, and I said, "I want to get a business loan." He said, "Why should I give you a business loan? What do you got for collateral?" I said, he said, "Do you own your house?" "No, we're renting." "Do you have any stocks or bonds?" "No." "How about your savings account?" "Don't ask." He said, "Why should I give you a loan? You don't have anything to put up. If you default on the loan, I'll be out the money." We don't come to God saying, "Look, I've got this, 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 and this, and this. Can I put this up for collateral so you'll give me eternal life?" We don't know. That's not how it happens. We come to him saying, "I am nothing. If you don't have mercy on me, I'm lost." It's like the song that we sang. He's the God who keeps covenant. He's the God who shows mercy. And according to Paul, before the world ever began, we were given grace. If you are here today and you know the Lord is your Savior, if you claim Yeshua to be your Savior, it's because before the world ever began, God had given his grace to come upon you. And you say, "Well, Tim, then we can just sit down and put our hands in our pockets and wait for people to get saved." No. God, in his magnificent sovereignty, chose to bring those who are his to himself through the witness of you and me. That's why Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." In some texts it says the gospel of the Messiah. "For it is the power of God that results in salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the non-Jew, to the Greek. By grace you have been saved, through faith. And it is not of yourself. It is a gift of God." You see, when we come to appreciate what God has done for us, he does. When we really come to appreciate it more and more, he doesn't have to, put a cuff on us to get us to do things, right? When you discover when somebody has loved you in a way that saved your life, you don't have to be coerced when they say, "Could you help me? Could you do something for me?" You say, "What can I do?" Right? And that's what's going on in our apostolic portion. Yeshua says, "You have been saved from eternal damnation. Now, do you want to be a servant to others?" What did Yeshua do? He gave up the glory in order to become a servant, even at the lowest level of human existence, where he was treated as a criminal and put upon a cross for you and for me. The love of God constrains us, right? That's what this is about. That's what this is about. There's another important difference between an Israelite slave and a slave from the nations in the Torah. An Israelite slave always has the option of redemption, either by the intervention of a family member or through his own means if he is able to acquire the redemption price. The manner in which the redemption price is calculated relates to the remaining years up to the Yovel, or the Jubilee. This explains what would otherwise appear as a contradiction between our Parashah and Exodus 21, where an Israelite slave is released in the Shemitah, whereas in our text it appears his release is only in the Yovel. The explanation is that our Parashah is focusing upon the method of calculating the redemption price, which is predicated on the Yovel alone. Essentially, the calculation would be figured this way. The price paid for the slave would be divided by the number of years remaining until the Yovel. The redemption price would then be the amount of remaining years. Let's illustrate it using just common figures. Let's say an Israelite sold himself into slavery 10 years before the Yovel year, and the purchase price was $100. Any of you homeschoolers figure out what that is per year? 10 years, $100. How much a year? Yeah, $10. You're right. It would calculate to $10 per year. If after serving 2 years, the slave was able to pay for his redemption, the price would be $80, right? It seems clear that the years were calculated beginning with Yom Teruah, that's my understanding. Though the text does not give explicit instructions on this, one would presume that a partial year would be prorated in accordance with the amount equal to a full year. So, that kind of reading between the lines, but apparently that's how we're supposed to do it. Okay, comment? Oh, Mike has a comment first. I'm in the middle of page 3, and I have just a few minutes left. Finally, if an Israelite slave was redeemed, he still would was not redeemed, he still would go free at the Shemitah year, including the Yovel. In this way, no Israelite family could ever be indentured permanently, and not even for a period longer than 7 years against his will, of course. If an Israelite sold himself into slavery in order to pay a debt, and the debt required serving longer than 7 years, then he would be required to serve the full amount unless sufficient means were found to buy his redemption. Yet even if the debt had not been paid by the time of the Yovel, the Jubilee year, then it was canceled. All debts were marked paid at the Yovel year. This is what is meant by the phrase, "He shall not rule over him with severity in your sight." Severity translates this word that's kind of hard to understand, perich, which means to crush, and in terms of slavery jargon, to denote perpetual slavery or slavery that was generational. Such could never be the case for an Israelite slave. One of the several difficulties that arise from our Parashah is the meaning of sojourner in this text. And we've talked about this. Sometimes sojourner can mean one who has attached himself or herself to Israel. Therefore, that one is to be treated with the same laws as a native born. And then there's the sojourner that has no attachment to Israel or to Israel's God, and they're treated in a different way. Now, I wanted to just mention something in the apostolic portion. In the passage that we read in John 13, I just wanted to note something here that I think is significant. Unfortunately, in our Messianic circles, some of what are the absolute foundational truths of the Scriptures are being questioned and or denied. One of these is the deity of Yeshua. And some might say, well, boy, I haven't heard that. Yeah, well, if you do some searching, you discover that there are plenty of groups out there, and they're becoming more numerous, unfortunately, it seems to me, from what I hear, where they're questioning how Yeshua could be divine. And they're trying to come up with the same kind of, can I use the H word, heresies that were perpetrated in the early centuries. And so what happens then is that people in the Christian church look at the Messianic movement as a whole and say these people are very off theologically. They're getting into heresy and so forth and so on. Now, in verse 13 of chapter 13, and I'm just going to take a couple of verses here, Yeshua says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." Now, when you look at the word "I am" in the Greek, and here I've given it to you in the Greek, and I've given kind of a wooden translation. You address me as the teacher and the Lord, and you speak well, for that is who, and then I am. But notice, it's two words. It's "ami," and it's the word "gar," which means for. In Greek, the word "for," F-O-R, can never come first in the sentence. It's called post-positive. It has to be second, at least, or more. Okay? So it just says "ami," which is the verb to be in the present tense. Okay? Am I getting too technical? Okay. How do you say, what's the present tense verb for the first person I in English? I am. Right. Okay. One word. I am. Okay. Actually two in English, but one word in Greek. Yeah. Old English would do that also, right. Now, there's another verse in the same passage, which is verse 19, where he says, after he washes their feet, right, he says, I've given you an example, as you've seen me do, he says, for now I am telling you before it comes to pass, so when it does occur, you may believe that I am he. Now that I am, in that case, adds another word. It's not the same. It says, ego eimi. You say, well, why is that important, Tim? Well, I'm glad you asked. The addition of that little word there, okay? If we did it woodenly, for now on, I'm saying to you before the thing happens, so that you may believe when it happens that I am. And notice I capitalized the A on M. Here's why. We have a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, right? It's called the Septuagint. We abbreviate it LXX, which stands for 50, 60, 70. It stands for the 70 because tradition had it that there were 70 who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. So it's called the 70 or the Septuagint, which means 70, okay, in Latin. Okay. Remember Exodus 3:14? Moses is asking God, okay, you told me to go and tell the people to take them out of Egypt, but they're going to say, who sent you? What should I say? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now, you all know what the Hebrew says there. I didn't put the Hebrew up here. It doesn't say I am who I am. It says what? Yeah. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. And why? Because in Hebrew, there's no present tense of the verb to be. It doesn't exist. Now, later on, I agree, a participle, hoveh, becomes used, but it's not really, it's something extra. How do you say in Hebrew, I think probably all of you know this, how do you say, if somebody says, Ma shlomcha, how is your peace? What do you say? Ani beseder or ani tov. So ani is I, and good. You can't say I am good. I good. It sounds like some people that we've helped with foreign languages when they've come, they leave also because in their language they don't have a verb to be in the present tense. They don't have the word am, A-M. What's that? Sometimes some of the Asian languages do not have a present tense in the verb to be. They don't have a word for am. So they just say, I good, or I go to store. That's not uncommon. Well, the same thing was in Hebrew. Okay? So how did the Septuagint translators translate it? Do you see something in blue? They translated this passage with the same Greek that we have in John 13 and in some other places, many other places actually. Literally, the Greek says, and God said to Moses, I am the one who is. And now I'm translating the Greek, okay? Because the Greek has a present tense for the verb to be, I am. I am the one who is. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the one who is has sent me to you. Now, the Hebrew says, I will be what I will be. How can that be translated into the one who is? Because can you say that tomorrow you'll be exactly the same as today? No, you can't. You don't know. You could fall down and get an injury. You could break a leg. You could, who knows what, right? None of us can say, I will always be what I will be. No, we can't say that. Only God can say that, which means what? He never changes. So when the Greek translator said, how are we going to translate this? If we translate it in the future, it doesn't make sense. What it means is, I will always be what I will always be. So you can trust me never to change. Like it says in Malachi, is it? I am the Lord, I do not change. Therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. Let's look at one other place where we have this. John 8:58. Remember the context? They're trying to argue with Yeshua. He says, well, who are you? You're just a carpenter's son. Yeah, you're not even 50 years old. What right do you have to tell us what to do? And they said, in fact, we think you have a demon, or you're a Samaritan, or something crazy like that. And he said, Abraham longed to see my day. And they said, wait a minute, you're not even 50 years old. And Abraham, you saw Abraham, Abraham saw you? How's that possible? What does he say? Yeshua said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. That's very bad Greek. How would you normally say it? Before Abraham was born, I was. Not I am. Guess what? The exact same thing that we have in our text. When he said, pardon me? Ego eimi. Ego eimi. He's saying, in our text that we had today, he said, I'm going to tell you what happens before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am ego eimi, that I am the same one who was speaking to Moses. I am Yod He Vav He. In the flesh. Now, is that impossible? Yes. Is God the God of the impossible? Yes. Can we explain it? We cannot explain it. Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham existed, I have always existed. There was never a time when Yeshua did not exist. Now, if you take that into consideration, you look back in Isaiah 40 through 45, and the Creator, Yod He Vav He, says, who was with me when I created? No one. Say, well, Tim, you're just saying that Yeshua was with him. That's right, I am. Say, well, can you explain how one can be three or three can be one? No, I can't explain that. It doesn't work in our world. It doesn't work in our brains. But it is a biblical truism. And either we believe that Yeshua is one with the Father and the Spirit in a way that makes him eternal, equal in power and majesty and glory. Now, when he came as the incarnate one, he set aside that glory. He even says in John 17, he says, Father, restore to me the glory which I had with you before the world began. And remember that in the ancient world, when you say before the world began, it means from all eternity. Okay? So what does this tell us? It tells us that our Savior, in the mystery of the incarnation, came to die for us as a man, as one of us. But he resides in heaven today with his Father, the Ruach, the one and only God. And when it says, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, please don't read that as meaning composite. The context would indicate that it means he is the only one. There's no other God. How do we know that? Because it goes on to say, you shall love him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. You don't have to divide any of your allegiance up because there's no one else to divide it to. So when Yeshua says, I and the Father are one, he gave us that mystery in a nutshell. Don't try to unravel it. You'll ruin it. Confess the mystery, the glorious mystery of Yeshua, who is God in the flesh, now residing in heaven. We have that in our text. I just wanted to bring it up and kind of say, let's not forget this. This is very important.